present value. You have the whole set of taxes and present value. Those taxes, we know, are equal in present value to all the government spending. So notionally, we can think of subtracting government spending from income, taking the present discounted value of that. That's equivalent to thinking of this in terms of taxes. So once I've told you what the government spends, that's going to tell you overall how much tax it needs to collect. And once you know that overall amount, you don't need to know whether it's taxes now or taxes in the future. They're equivalent. So I can describe the household's budget constraint without making any reference at all to the actual levels of taxes it faces. That's why requirement equivalence is going to hold in the Fisher model, because the budget constraint, which is all you need to know in order to understand what the household will consume once you've got the preferences, that budget constraint won't depend on the timing of taxes. So, if you think about what this equation we've just derived, what it means in terms of our diagram, so suppose this was the budget constraint. And that was the point where households choose to consume. Now the position of that budget constraint, as I've just told you, depends on income. That's the horizontal coordinate, current income. Vertical coordinate is future income. When there are taxes, that has to be disposable income. But what we conclude from the equation above is, equivalently, I could have found the level of government spending, which might be here. It might be that the government is borrowing. Those two points must lie on the same budget line. We've just seen that the household budget constraint can be written in two ways. One, income minus taxes, present discounted value, or income minus government spending, present discounted value. Those deliver the same answer, given the government's budget constraint. So we know either of those points are on the budget line, so it suffices to look only at one of them, and therefore you can just look where given government spending is this red dot, budget line passes through that. Once I know that, I know what the consumption choice is. That's why the timing of taxes doesn't matter. Suppose you were to do in this example a tax cut. What would happen? Suppose the government does a tax cut. What will change? Draw it for yourself now. What will be different in this picture if the government now decides to cut taxes? It doesn't change its spending. So it leaves spending on education, health, defence, all of those things unchanged. It just cuts taxes. As a result, of course, it must do what? It must borrow. What does it have to therefore to do with taxes in the future? Let's put them up. What precisely will that imply in terms of this diagram? What will change? What won't change? So show me using the Fisher model a tax cut financed by government borrowing, running a deficit, increasing the deficit. I mean, there's already a deficit here to begin with. If you think about it, this distance here, that's the government's budget deficit, which you can't see it. That would be the budget deficit of the government. The government increases the deficit, gives people a tax cut. What will happen? Basically, think about which of the coordinates of these 3 points is going to change, if any of them. One is the consumption choice, one is disposable income, and one is this point where we've argued that point is equivalent to the disposable income point in the sense of being on the same budget constraint, but is calculated by subtracting government spending from income rather than taxes. So what changes in the diagram? So what will change? This point's going to change. Obviously because we're cutting taxes. The tax cut means T1 down. So, we have to move this point. Which way does it move? We know it's going to go somewhere right. The question is, does it remain on this budget line? Does it move to here? Why not? Why can it not go here? It has to stay on the budget line. That's what the mathematics tells us. What would you say in economic terms why it can't possibly be here? So putting this point here would be saying you can leave future taxes unchanged. You can't, of course, if you don't change government spending and you give people a tax cut, you can't satisfy the government's budget constraints, but you left future taxes unchanged. You wouldn't be repaying the debt that you were issuing. So you must raise T2 to repay debt. If you raise T2, that means the vertical coordinate falls. Now then that means you're moving sort of southeast, and then the mathematics shows us that you're actually moving on the same line. So you'd be moving down exactly the same budget constraint. The reason is that you haven't changed interest rates, you haven't changed the gradient, you haven't changed income, y. We know, therefore, that this red dot is on the budget line. That hasn't moved. The gradient hasn't changed, so the line is the same. We know the disposable income form is on the same line, same budget line as the red dot. Therefore, if the coordinates change, it must just be moving along the line. You might move to here. So that's the tax cut. And of course, this is the future tax rise to repay the debt. So you're moving that way. Now, as the budget line has not changed, there is no reason for consumption choice to change. And that's Ricardian equivalence. People don't change their consumption behavior. What about their saving behavior? Don't fall into the trap of saying that there are two pitfalls to the students' understanding of Ricardian equivalence. They tend to make the statement so strong that they're claiming things that are mutually contradictory. So I often see answers that claim Ricardian equivalence tells you that neither consumption nor saving will change in response to a tax cut. That simply can't be right. I mean, what's the definition of saving? Household saving. So private saving or household saving, how do we define that? It's disposable income, which is Y1 minus T1, because we're talking about current income. It's disposable income that's not consumed, so minus C1. If you think about it, if we conclude that C doesn't change when taxes change, we have to accept that saving is going to adjust. You can't say saving is unaffected by a tax cut. Either consumption or saving must change. So which way does saving go when you get a tax cut? Must go, I mean, the tax cut is giving you more disposable income. You're not consuming it, therefore you must be saving it, so saving must rise. So this distance here, this tax cut distance is also the change in saving. There's also extra saving. I don't really have space to write it, but that's extra saving. They're equal. There is one notion of saving which really is unaffected by tax cut according to Ricardian equivalence. So those of you saying, there's a small minority of people, so I think most of you actually from your answers, did actually understand Ricardian equivalence pretty well. But some of you are making this false claim about saving, but there is actually one definition of saving that would be unaffected by a tax cut. There is one case where Ricardian equivalence says saving doesn't change. Obviously not this definition of saving, that has to rise. What other kinds of saving are there? National saving. What is national saving? So that was household saving, or private saving. You could also come up with a notion of national saving. How do we define that? Usually denoted SN. How do we define it? Household saving, the SP, plus any government saving. So in our case here, national saving is Y1 minus T1 minus C1, the private saving part, plus government saving, that's the opposite of the government budget deficit, so T1 minus G1. Notice that taxes actually cancel out from the national saving expression. And you have income, pre-tax income, minus consumption, minus government spending. So national saving is invariant to tax cuts under Ricardian equivalence. Basically, you're just changing who does the saving. The government saves less, households save more. The government saves more, households save less. You're just swapping around who's doing the saving. Ultimately, because it's the government spending that determines how many resources are left over for households to consume. That's what they make their decision on the basis of. Okay, so if you're going to assert that the Ricardian equivalence says saving doesn't change, you really need to make it clear what type of saving we're talking about. That's a good guide answering any kind of question. Don't leave ambiguities hanging in the air, otherwise the examiners may not give you the benefit of the doubt. So try to be clear, as always, in your answers. There was one further stretching of Ricardian equivalence beyond its legitimate bounds that I saw many times in answers. I often came across the assertion that Ricardian equivalence tells you all fiscal policy is completely irrelevant. So it doesn't matter whether the government spends, taxes, whatever it does, there's no effect at all on the economy. What's wrong with that stretching of Ricardian equivalence? Which is actually, that error actually you often read in the financial press as well. There's lots of people out there that don't understand what Ricardian equivalence means. So what's wrong with the claim that government changes its spending that has no effect on consumption? Well, it's a very different example from the tax cut. Tax cut, the government gives you some money now and has to take it away in the future. So overall, you're no better or worse off than you were before, under the assumptions of the Ricardian equivalence proposition. But suppose the government decides to spend more now. Are you better or worse off? Well, I mean, maybe the government spending has some use, but let's just think in terms of just the implications for your budget. Government spends more now, so decides to build a new road. Do you change your consumption? Well, in this case, the government has to raise taxes either now or in the future. However, in that example, there's no tax cut. So it's not that you're being given something and then having it taken away. It's either you're having something taken away from you now or something taken away from you in the future. But you're having something taken away from you in both cases. It's true you're getting a road, so maybe that's actually a good thing. But in terms of your private spending, you're losing at some point. Either you pay a tax now or you pay it in the future. In that case, of course, you would change your consumption. So don't fall into the trap of saying, if the government changes spending, this has no effect on consumption. That's nonsense. I mean, in that case, taxes have to rise at some point, and no one is getting more disposable income as a result of a tax cut anyway. So it's simply not true that consumption will be unaffected. Can you show me the effect in the Fisher diagram of what I've just said? Can you make precise what I've just said? So suppose the government raises spending G1. What happens to the Fisher diagram? What happens to consumption? Start it out like I did before, but just take out the tax cut. So using the same diagram to start with, just take out the tax cut, the tax rise. So start from those 3 points: a point with disposable income, a point with income minus government spending, and the consumption choice. Suppose the government raises spending. What happens to the diagram? Let me draw you a fresh diagram anyway, because we're going to need a fresh diagram, otherwise this one is too cluttered up. So, So the exercise in question is to increase G1. Everything else is held equal. Well, at least everything that we can hold equal. I guess to be precise, that means G2 doesn't change. So we build a road, but it's not that we slash spending on roads in the future. will happen? Which, if any of these points, is going to move? Well, you may think there's some information lacking here because we haven't said anything about taxes, but let's leave that disposable income point till the end. Come back to that. We have enough information to deal with this red point, which was this point that was equivalent in the sense of lying on the same budget line to the disposable income point. So what happens to it? Which way does it move? The vertical coordinate doesn't change because we hold constant spending in the future. The horizontal coordinate goes down, so it goes which way? Left. So somewhere over here, there'll be a new version of this point. Now, where is the budget line now? Has to pass through this point, so it's shifted. It's going to be a parallel shift because the gradient is just the interest rate. There's no reason for that to change here. I mean, maybe it would in a more complicated general equilibrium analysis, but the Fisher model is not a theory of interest rates. It takes the interest rate as given. So we have to leave the interest rate constant in this exercise. So we get a parallel shift. So what would happen to consumption? Once we know where the budget line is, we can then ask the question, how would households react? Where will their new consumption plan be? They can't afford the one they were buying before. So they react by choosing a lower consumption plan, or where a number of difference curve, a lower one is tangent to the new budget line. To get a fall in consumption now and in the future. So it's clearly not true that Ricardian equivalence says that high government spending has no effect on consumption. Ricardian equivalence, though, does say something about this example. You'll notice that we've reached a conclusion for consumption without actually having to say what the government's tax policy was. I did not tell you how the government actually paid for the spending. So the government built a road, spent more. We deduced that private consumption by households went down now and in the future. I didn't need to tell you to reach that conclusion how the government paid for the road. There's two ways you could have paid for it, well, many ways you could have paid for it, but there's two natural cases to think of. One where it raises taxes now, and one where it borrows, and therefore has to raise taxes in the future. But those two cases are equivalent. That's actually the equivalence that Ricardian equivalence is referring to. That two ways of paying for the spending have the same impact on consumption. So the change in C1 and C2 C1 star, C2 star is the same irrespective whether it's taxes up or borrowing up. Borrowing, of course, means future taxes. So, all of those cases, and any intermediate case where you raise taxes a bit now and borrow a bit, and therefore raise taxes as well in the future, all of those cases are equivalent in terms of their effect on consumption. Not in terms of their effect on saving again. Private saving by households will differ in all these cases. But again, national saving would also, the effect of national saving would be equivalent. So consumption, national saving, there all that matters is the government spending plans. Timing of taxes doesn't matter. Timing of taxes only matters for private saving. So that's Ricardian equivalence. This example is truer to the original spirit of Ricardian equivalence. The example Ricardo had in mind, which was how to pay for a war. There, the government spending is rising temporarily. Should you raise taxes? Should you borrow? Ricardo was saying the whole debate was moot because it didn't make any difference which way round the government did it. Okay, so let's don't fall into those traps that I just described about how you can misunderstand what Ricardian equivalence is saying. It's not as strong a proposition as some people seem to think it is. Still a pretty strong one. It still needs a lot of assumptions, but it does not say all fiscal policy has no effect. Okay, let's do the final part of the one question on consumption. So, part C. So part C is about why this theory of consumption, this Fisher model of consumption, is a good theory. You might wonder why we have so many different theories of consumption in macroeconomics. You can think of the simplest one as being the Keynesian model of consumption. This is a more complicated theory. Why do we need a more complicated theory? Presumably, theories are ultimately judged as successful or not on the basis of whether they're able to be consistent with what we observe in the real world, what we observe in data. So this question is about how the Fisher model can be consistent with more data than more basic theories of consumption like the Keynesian consumption equation. Okay, so firstly, let's just try to understand what's being said in the question. So it's talking about the marginal propensity to consume. And that is, marginal propensity to consume means if income goes up by $1, how much of that dollar is spent. 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume gets saved. So this question talks about two types of data. Cross-sectional data, time series data. If you do econometrics, you'll know what is meant by those terms. So who can tell me what cross-sectional means as opposed to time series? So we're going to be talking about data on two things, consumption and income. So what's a cross-section? It's a description of the type of data we have. So these are two different kinds of data. It's not that we're talking about different variables. In both cases, we're going to be talking about consumption and income. It's not the type of variable we're looking at. It's where that data comes from. So what's a cross-section? Well, you are a cross-section. There are, I don't know, maybe 100 people in the room. That's 100 data points. So I can ask each of you, what's your income? What's your consumption? And each of you would therefore be a dot or a cross plotted in this graph. I guess it's impolite to ask people what their income is, but I guess as your students, some of you probably have quite a low income because you should be spending your time studying, I hope. But maybe you have jobs as well. I don't know what the norm is in Singapore for students. When I was a student, I had low consumption, but even lower income. So I'll be on. Well, I guess that's against the spirit of a cross section. I should describe where I am now. So I guess let's put a 45-degree line on this diagram. So I'm going to claim I'm about here in this diagram. It's not drawn to scale. Where are you in this diagram? That's me. Where are you? Maybe some of you are actually off the scale over here, and you're just studying for the sake of acquiring knowledge. You're actually have really high incomes from I don't know doing what.